Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for attending Design Miami and for coming to this talk that I have to tell you brings me so much joy to be able to introduce. Glenn Adamson is our very own curatorial director for this edition, our 20th edition of the fair, and moving forward into our 20th anniversary in 2025. So we are already plotting and planning all the things we're going to do, and it's been a true joy to work with him for this specific fair with the blue sky theme so that we all just think big, think outside the box, and think blue sky. So it's been such a wonderful experience, which is going to come to an end in 3 days, but the new one starts. In the meantime, though, I will read from these notes because there are just too many things to say about Glenn and Spencer that I will read. So Glenn Adamson, as I said, is our own very own curatorial director, but he is a curator, writer, and historian based in New York and London. He's previously been the director of the Museum of Arts and Design and head in New York and the head of research at the V&A. Dr. Adamson's publications are too many to list, but we can tell you that later today, right now, we have the pleasure of hosting a talk with Glenn on his new book launching right here at the fair, A Century of Tomorrows, published by Bloomsbury. Dr. Adamson is artistic director for Design Doha, a new biennale for Qatar, the first edition which took place to much acclaim earlier this year. He is the curator at large for the Rhode Design Museum and editor of Material Intelligence, a quarterly online journal published by the Christoph Foundation. His current curatorial projects include Toshiko Takezu, Worlds Within, from the Isamu Noguchi Museum, which has now traveled to the Cranbrook Museum in Detroit, and Nike, Form Follows Motion for the Vitra Design Museum. He's wearing the sneakers, just so you all know. Spencer Bailey is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of New York-based media company The Slowdown and host of the time-sensitive podcast. He's also the editor-at-large and of book publisher Phaedon. A writer, editor, and journalist, he has written at length about architecture, art, culture, and design, and contributed to publications such as Town and Country, the New York Times Magazine, Bloomberg Business Week, and Fortune. From 2013 to 2018, Bailey was the editor-in-chief of Surface Magazine. In 2023 and 2024, he was named to the Wallpaper USA 300 and USA 400 lists, respectively, as a curator preserving and promoting creative culture. He also serves as co-chair of the Board of Trustees of the Noguchi Museum in Long Island City, New York, and is on the advisory council of the Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. Pretty impressive. So I leave you now with these two lovely gentlemen to discuss A Century of Tomorrows by Glenn Adamson. Thank you.
Thank you, Grella. Let's start with A Century of Tomorrows, the title. I think it's a beautiful title. Tell me about how you constructed the title. Did it come before the book? Did it come after the book? How'd you land on it?
I suppose, appropriately enough, it came after the book. I should say, by the way, big thank you to Design Miami, because it's highly unusual that the curatorial director is given the stage like this, so feeling super grateful right now. But I had written most of the book already by the time I had a title, and it was a bit of a struggle. The origin of the project was actually an exhibition, and it was going to be at the V&A, as Grella mentioned. I used to be head of research there. And a long time ago, maybe 2012, I had an exhibition on the books there called The Future, A History. So it was going to be the museum in future tense. That was the idea. So start with a Last Judgment panel from the Middle Ages and then go from there. That was kind of the concept, right down to the present day. And so when I wrote the book, I knew it had to change dramatically from that exhibition idea. So I decided to focus on the 20th century. And I guess the phrase A Century of Tomorrows did suggest to me some of the language from the books I was reading and the films that I was watching as research. And in fact, that informs the cover as well. So it has this kind of Orson Welles-y 1930s quality to me. But I guess I was also thinking about the kind of poignancy and, in a way, the dizzying, thrilling, and yet melancholic experience of a whole century's worth of days, each of which had been a tomorrow and had been looked forward to or dreaded, and the kind of weight of that expectation and uncertainty. And that's what I wanted to write about.
Well, yeah, the relationship of time, which is something I think a lot about with my podcast. I would say time is sort of the central conceit of the book in some ways. Time and tempo. We'll get to speed later in the conversation, but I wanted to ask just about the role of time, how we perceive it, how you thought about constructing this book around time, how you think about past, present, future when you're writing a book about the past, but about futuring in the past.
Yes, exactly. So just to explain, first of all, the book is about predicting the future in the 20th century. So we'll kind of break that down in a second. But it's, as you say, it's this kind of strange, knot-like shape of me in the present looking back to the past at the way they predicted the future, and therefore informing the way that we ourselves might look at our own future and our present based on that past. So it's a real brain twister, and it kind of was like that to write. You could kind of get lost in it. But I think that the key thing is that, of course, you only ever have the present, right? And this is our great topic, right? Spencer, between you and I, we've had a lot of conversations about this, that time eludes you and famously slips through your grasp, right? Like the fabled sands in the hourglass. And of course it extends infinitely back and infinitely forward. And you're at this infra-thin, always escaping moment of now that in a way is nothingness and also is everything. And what I wanted to do was to fill that philosophically compelling, confounding situation in with the kind of the full emotional, political, social, cultural content that the future bears upon it. So the kind of terror and hope, which is also why the idea of the Last Judgment has always been a really key image for me. I mentioned it in the show, and it also figures in the book, this image of, you have God, and on his one side you have the souls rising to heaven, on the other side you have the souls rising or falling down to hell, to the inferno. And so there's this feeling of which way are we going, which way am I going as a human being? And so there's that dialectic of hope and fear that really organizes the book.
Yeah, and I have to ask you about writing the book now, because writing a book like this where you're in this twisted time spectrum, whatever you want to call it, must have been very intense to sit down and know how to unpack this. It's very different from your other books in that sense. Your other books are a much more straightforward sort of historical analysis in some ways. But this one, you're actually talking about, far futuring. We'll talk about some of the essays that, or texts or films that you reference, but like, how did you kind of approach actually just sitting down to write? Because I imagine that must have been very intense to try to figure out like your place in time in the context of this sort of time warp or time pretzel. Yeah.
So, well, for one thing, I started writing it during the pandemic, and I finished it when the pandemic was lessening, and so we had the reacceleration period, and now we're in whatever we're in, the car crash or freedom that has resulted from that acceleration. So I began it in this moment of stasis, which was quite eerie, as we all remember. And that seemed like a great time to be writing a book like this. And then weirdly, the reconnection also felt super relevant. So I felt constantly informed by that temporal environment. I guess, do you mind if I talk about the craft versus future thing as well?
Yeah.
So some of you may know I've written a lot of books and essays about craft in various guises. And it occurred to me belatedly as I was working on the project that this book was almost like the mirror image of writing a book about craft, because craft is generally thought of as being traditional, so kind of backward looking, so into the past. And also it's regarded as being extremely reliable and in a way almost sometimes disappointingly reliable, like inflexible or static, although that's not how I necessarily view it. Whereas, so that's how we think of artisans, let's say, as these kind of solid citizens. And then futurologists, of course, are exactly the opposite. They're looking into the future, and basically their whole thing is a confidence game, like, why should we trust them, right? And so you have no sense of, when they're making a prediction, you have no sense of why you should listen to them, whether they're right or wrong. And by the time you know, it's probably too late, and they're kind of slipping away from you, right? So they're kind of anti-craftsmen, or anti-craftspeople. And of course, that made them deeply fascinating for me.
It makes me think of a conversation I heard, I think it was earlier this year, Sam Altman on the New York Times, I think it was the Technology Podcast, and he was talking about AI. We'll definitely talk about AI today, but he was talking about AI and the things AI can't do. And basically everything that he mentioned that AI can't do was craft.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. I think I wrote in Fewer Better Things, one of my earlier books, that we still haven't invented a robot that can walk across a forest floor, which is so haunting, right? Like, how simple is that? How joyful is that? How human is that? And in fact, the proof of its humanity is that we can't replace it easily, right? So yeah, OpenAI and in general, the deep history of artificial intelligence does figure into the book in a lot of ways.
And you open the book in, I think, unexpected way, tarot cards. to talk about that, why tarot cards, obviously they in their own way or form are a design object or craft object, but why tarot cards, and how does that play into this sort of futuring?
Yeah, so one reason that I decided to start that way was that I had discovered the existence of this woman called Pixie Smith, who I don't think is very well remembered. But if you picture a tarot card with those amazing illustrations that look kind of medieval, and you might think that they're adaptations of some centuries old design, but those were actually designed in the 19-teens by this incredible woman called Pixie Smith, who was Jamaican, living in London, possibly gay, we're not sure about that, definitely a bohemian, and kind of all up in the theosophy zone. So she was very close with a lot of the spiritualists who would also have been adjacent to abstract artists. She showed some of her own artwork with Alfred Stieglitz at the 291 Gallery. So she had a lot of interesting connections and has been totally lost to history, and yet has made one of the most popular and well-known iconographies of the 20th century. So I kind of wanted to feature her and kind of get one of these protagonists out early. But also I was just thinking about my own limited experience of tarot cards. I mean, I've had a couple of readings. I know a lot of people who are interested in it. And one thing that's always impressed me about it is that people might even think of themselves on some level as engaging in some kind of futurological exercise when they get a tarot reading, like what's going to happen to me or what should I do. But in fact, it's much more like a personality test or a personality exploration, we could say. So it's really about connecting to you in the moment and really being in touch with your motivations and trying to clarify things. It's almost therapeutic. And I felt like that was a perfect metaphor for futurology. And in fact, I think the worst thing you can do as a historian of the future is to go back at previous predictions and kind of weigh them up. Like, how did they do? Because that, well, for starters, is just a banal exercise, but also it puts you in the position of what E.P. Thompson called, in a very different context, the enormous condescension of history, right? Like, it makes you think you're a lot cleverer than they were just for living later, which is a real tendency that people have, I think, when they engage with history. They get very judgy about it. And so if you instead think about futurology of 1900, 1920, 40, 60, 80 as being more like an exquisite self-portrait of that moment, then you have something to think about. And that's very much what a tarot card reading is like, I think.
Right, so if tarot card readers are like personal Imagineers, let's say, then futurologists are world Imagineers. They're looking at the world in the way that a tarot card reader looks at a person.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's a key point. Thank you for saying that, Spencer. So, you know, this is not a book about people investing in real estate, it's, you know, for themselves. It's a book about people building cities, right? It's not a book about people making a painting. It's about people thinking about the future of creativity itself. So it's very large scale. It's another way in which it's opposite to my craft work, which of course is all about the human scale. I always define it as skilled making at human scale. This, for me, is craft.
One thing I feel like all your books do, I think you're great at as a curator and a writer, is bringing up these sort of unsung, lost to history sort of voices, the one you just referenced with the tarot cards, but also there's this great one in the book that I wanted to bring up, John Elfrith Watkins Jr.
Yeah.
This guy was a one-legged mechanical engineer, and he wrote this essay for the Ladies' Home Journal, and Ladies' Home Journal actually comes up several times in the book.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of interesting that this was like a sort of, that was like a cultural Bible of the times in America, like the early 20th century. And this essay was titled, "What May Happen in the Next 100 Years."
Yeah.
The predictions are actually, not to dwell on it, but they actually are pretty uncanny. Like a lot of what Elfrith Watkins Jr. wrote was quite accurate, actually.
That's right. Yeah.
Like even like predicting computer screens and being able to communicate across continents. This is written in 1900.
Yeah, exactly. And he was predicting what would happen at the end of the century, so our past now. And he was a mechanical engineer, but he also became a curator at the Smithsonian. And I didn't mention I was also on the curatorial team for this big project at the Smithsonian called Futures. That was a kind of World's Fair of futurology, you could say. So that was another thing that kickstarted the book project for me. But what was so interesting to me about Watkins was that you could simultaneously be impressed and sort of, you could also laugh at other predictions he made. So he did predict effectively the internet in 1900, which is pretty good going. But he also thought that strawberries would be the size of watermelons, and he thought that rats and mice and fleas would be totally eradicated. And he also thought that we wouldn't have the letter J, right? So some things were like, wow, how did he know that? And some things were like, whoa, why did he? And for me, the point again is, standing in judgment of somebody like that, that doesn't seem like the relevant or interesting exercise.
Yeah. I mean, looking at these futurologists, what do you feel like you learned about futurology at large? I ask this because, I think when we think about the future, we tend to want to be positive. Obviously, we have climate crisis and other realities in our present moment that maybe lean us toward a less positive seeming future, but I think in the context of futurology, it tends to be a positive thing. At the same time, though, as you point out in the book, futurology also negates and ignores all kinds of people, places, the planet itself in a lot of cases. A lot of futurologists were eugenicists. Just talk about maybe the dark side of futurology.
Yeah, for sure. So here we're kind of getting into the real kind of hardcore of the subject. I guess my overall, again, without wanting to stand in judgment of futurologists, I guess if I had one big takeaway, it's that the futurology that I tended to admire was expansive and tried to open up unlooked for horizons of possibility and just point to them and show that they were there as eventual, maybe not even likely, but certainly possible futures. And then on the other hand, the constraining, clenching futures, let's say, that try to limit possibility mainly because of the feeling that minimizing risk would be a good thing to do, which is understandable, of course, and again, super, very, very human. That seemed to me to be a much less sympathetic position. And by the way, maybe we can get into this, but I would very, very much say that our contemporary political divisions are organized around those lines. So rather than being conventional left versus right or Marxist versus pro-capitalist antipathy, I think instead what we have is effectively expansive versus constraining future instincts, with Trump obviously being the exemplar of the latter position, hence the wall. So that's a big takeaway for me. And of course, one of the advantages of thinking about it in that way is that it helps you be sympathetic to the position that you don't have, because you'd be foolish not to think of the future, at least with some sense of risk and concern and worry. But trying to crush it so that it has no possibility or openness is, first of all, self-defeating and also extremely ungenerous to future generations. And by contrast, trying to create structures that are permissive and open and absorbing, I think, is a much better position, at least for me. But it does, as I say, give you sympathy to the opposite position. But yeah, I mean, dark futures, there's plenty of those, that's for sure. And they go all across the political spectrum, from the most communistic to the most fascist. I write about them a lot in my book. Even in the context of racial politics and gender politics, I think there's some very dark, predictive and forecasting that I try to talk about in the book as well. So it's, the future is hell, right? In a literal sense, that's the last judgment again, and that's a big part of the story.
Yeah, I was actually just in Madrid and stood in front of the Garden of Earthly Delights for a long time, and it just makes me think of that is a painting that reflects this idea of hell in the future, for sure.
The Hieronymus Bosch painting. What's so interesting about that, of course, is it is a basically Last Judgment format, but you have heaven on one side, hell on the other side. In the middle, you have the Garden of Earthly Delights, which is kind of where we live in some weird surrealist, proto-surrealistic way. And it has the dizzying disorienting quality of actual life sort of brought into a higher key. It's a very intriguing way of thinking about the future.
So it's not in the title or the subtitle, but this book is distinctively, or not distinctively, but mostly American or mostly U.S. focused. And your previous book, Craft in American History, was entirely U.S. focused. What is it about the U.S. and futuring? Why is America, I guess, become this hub of innovation and technology? And maybe you could talk about, Henry Ford, Orson Welles, some of the characters that appear in your books.
Well, it of course goes back earlier than the 20th century. So the definition or the defining feature of America up until the late 19th century was, of course, thought to be its frontier. So this idea of an expanding country. And obviously now we rightly have recast that idea of the frontier more as a battle zone between colonizers and inhabitants of the Native American population, which is another storyline I try to follow through the whole 20th century. Once you get to the 20th century, of course, there's this famous thesis by essentially a historian or sociologist, the Turner thesis, that once you have the death of the frontier, you have a transformation in American culture, and the frontier has to be recast in economic and technological terms instead of spatial and geographic terms. And so that is the 20th century. You also have a lot of people at the time, and maybe even now in retrospect, claiming the 20th century as the American century, defined by American culture. And I'm aware we have a lot of people in the room who aren't American, so I should hasten to add, I don't buy that. Obviously, it's like a propagandistic trope. But the idea that America is where pop culture is generated, America is where capitalism, which of course is a fundamentally future-oriented economic structure like return on investment, right? Risk management, those are all capitalistic ways of thinking, and that America embodies them and epitomizes them. That, for me, made it very logical to headquarter the book in the United States, even though I'd take trips out to England and the Soviet Union and Ghana and other places.
Yeah, and I guess also just thinking about futuring as something that in the 20th century was connected to power. And so a lot of the characters, it's white men, most of the futurologists were. Of course, you bring a lot of other voices rightly into the book, but how do you reflect on that in the context of the 20th century and thinking about that, and what sort of impact did that white male-centric futurology have?
Right. So this is simply a transposition of the distinction I was making earlier between expansive and constraining futures, brought into the domain of who gets to be a futurologist in the first place, right? So if you have a very, very narrow demographic of white men, middle-class white men, straight white men, cis white men, right? You have this, of course, incredibly limited, blinkered idea of what the future could be, because it's a tiny percentage of the population, of which, of course, I'm a member. But I try to be extremely aware of that blindness that is imposed by that, simple limitation of view from the demographic perspective, as well as the patriarchal and hierarchical centralized perspective. So if you have any chance of having an effective constructive futurology, it has to be inclusive. So again, that obviously relates to our current political debates. I think in a more specific way, it was very interesting for me to look at the rise of the technocracy, as it was called, in the 1930s, and then in a way the culmination and then fall of the technocracy around the time of the Vietnam War and the counterculture, and to sort of trace that through a figure like Robert McNamara, who was he was the head of Ford, and then he became the Secretary of Defense that prosecuted the Vietnam War, and he was a futurologist. And so using him as not a bogeyman exactly, but more as an exemplar of that kind of centralized, ultimately quite fraudulent and foolish futurology, that was a fascinating example for me to learn about.
Oppenheim would be another pretty obvious one here, I think.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I mean, a lot of you have probably seen the film Oppenheimer. I mean, that film is obviously about the personal rise and fall of the optimism and ambition of a certain kind of faith in science, and then the deep regret and shame and bitterness that arises from that. So yeah, McNamara was a little bit more elusive than that. I quote somebody in the book saying that McNamara is like somebody who plays a game of cards and never shows you his hand, even after everybody's gotten up and left the table. And it's like, why won't you just show me your cards? So this kind of, like, what is his level of culpability?
Nice connection to tarot reading, too. Well, another character I wanted to bring up is Lewis Mumford. So maybe, I don't know if everyone in the room's familiar with Lewis Mumford and his work, so perhaps let's start there. Why don't you share a little bit about who he was and his importance in the context of this book?
Yeah, he's a very difficult person to describe because he's a very long career, and he was one of the most significant public intellectuals in the middle of the 20th century, back when we had public intellectuals. Wrote many, many books, had a very visible practice as a writing journalist as well. And I sort of pick up his story because he was very influential on the 1939 World's Fair, which of course I get into. The world, as you probably know, the theme of the 1939 World's Fair was the world of tomorrow, right? So it was very much a futurological exercise at a grand scale, sort of a Disneyland of the future before there was a Disneyland. And Mumford had proposed the theme, which I didn't know, but he was in one of these closed doors, kind of everybody smoking cigars sessions of all these white dudes. And he said, we should really make a World's Fair that's not about the past and, the glorious histories of all these countries, which is what World's Fair always had been. We should make a World's Fair that's speculative and actually looks into tomorrow. And then, so they took that theme up, all these business owners and civic leaders, and then it's clear that he sort of lost his influence when the companies came in and started basically turning the fair into a giant advertising spectacle, which is not what he had in mind at all, because he was very concerned about the effects of capitalism and the effects of the machine on society. And then he continued writing about that through the rest of his life, and eventually became very concerned with what we might call the military-industrial complex. And he wrote a book called The Pentagon of Power, for example, amazing title, right around the time of the Vietnam War, that was very critical of that. So he remained very futurological in his thinking, but increasingly critical and less optimistic. So for me, because I was tracing the passage of that early kind of streamlined, go, 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 almost deliriously optimistic futurology that emerges strangely in the Depression, almost as an antidote to the Depression, to its ultimate kind of crash and burn into postmodernism. His life happened to completely tally with that, and he sort of describes that arc as a human being, which I thought was fascinating.
And this year marks the 90th anniversary of his book, Technics and Civilization, which I think is an interesting marker in time. Maybe just share a little bit about that book, too, specifically, because I think that book actually is one of the most remarkable pieces of writing about the future, about technology, and the intersection of technology and civilization.
Yeah, so just very briefly, this is a book that was published obviously at the height of what we now call modernism. So if you're looking for the design side, it would be streamlining the first exhibition of machine art at the Bauhaus, which I think is the same year in 34. Is that right? 34 machine art at MoMA. So it's exactly that moment. And what he does is basically to recast the familiar idea of like the, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and he kind of recasts this and suggests that he comes up with new terms like the Paleotechnic would be ancient technology. And what he says is we're now in the Neotechnic culture, Neotechnic society, and all he means by that is a society that's determined by the newness of technology, the constant newness of technology, so that we're constantly being placed in a reactive mode as these new technologies evolve. I'm sure you can all relate to this, right? And he was really one of the first people to think of this. It's what Alvin and Heidi Toffler later called future shock in a 1972 book. I think it was published in 72.
I mean, he also made this very strong case that I think is still relevant today. You quote him in the book. It was a 1930 essay he wrote in a magazine, and he wrote, "The machine has conquered us. Now our turn has come, not to fight back, but to absorb our conqueror."
That's right. Yeah.
This is 1930.
Right. Can you imagine? Right. Most people don't even have a telephone, right? Yeah. So that's also is one of these weird things where the futurologists are almost getting ahead of themselves. But there's a whole thing in the book about the machine taking over the human and surpassing the human, which actually goes all the way back. Get this, guys. This goes back to the 1860s, right? And this amazing essay called Darwin Among the Machines that was published by this writer in New Zealand who was reacting to the Darwin, right? And what he argued was that basically he kind of got Darwin horribly wrong, but he said basically vegetables evolved into animals, and then animals are evolving into machines. And just like animals eat vegetables, machines are going to eat the animals, and we're animals, so the machines are going to eat us. I'm making it a little bit cartoonish, but effectively he was saying that we're going to evolve into a higher form of intelligence, which is machine intelligence. And he was saying that in the 1860s, which is really incredible. Samuel Palmer. So it's a very striking thing that people have been worrying about AI for over 150 years, and Mumford is part of that tradition.
Yeah, and I think that's something your book explores, but also something we still deal with and think about a lot in the present moment, which, you have Australia banning social media for anyone under the age of 16, for example, and I don't know, it just makes me think as I mentioned to you earlier, I just interviewed Malcolm Gladwell for my podcast. It'll be out in a couple of weeks. And Malcolm and I were talking about the future, actually. He has a very funny perspective on the future because he says that he doesn't really believe in thinking about expectations or anything. He doesn't like setting any expectations on his work or his, anything unfolding in the future. It's all about living in the right now, in the present, or in his case as a historian, the distant past. But we got into the subject of sort of technology and how it's very easy to just raise a flag and try and scream, "Oh, technology is ruining us, it's destroying society." And he was like, he doesn't see the smartphone as all that different from the TV. I slightly disagree, because the smartphone's in our pockets. Like it's easier to turn the TV off, leave the house. But I was kind of curious to hear your perspective or take on the sort of doomsaying around technology and that role in society, because there always will be the people on both sides, Elon Musks who want to go to Mars, and then the people on the totally other side of the spectrum.
Yeah, I think I might be somewhat prone to the historian's tendency to see both sides of it and want to find the reasonable place in the middle. One thing I wouldn't particularly align to is the idea that it would be more responsible just not to have expectations or to try to set structures in place for the future. I mean, if you just think about it for even a second, you realize that that's a terrible idea, because there are lots of horrible things that will happen if you don't think ahead that you can easily prevent, at least in most cases. So it means you need to have some kind of futurological structures in place. The question is who gets to be in charge of them, who designs them, which is why we're here talking about it as a design fair. This is ultimately a design question above all, you could argue. And there's a tremendous ethical burden there that needs to be considered very, very carefully. So this book is kind of a contribution to that.
I think you should write your next book on the iPhone. I would be really interested to.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah. Anyhow,
someone needs to write a book about the iPhone.
The role of speed we haven't gotten to yet. I wanted to get to. I feel like, in our past 20 years, it's like the sort of Facebook move fast and break things mentality. But you see that that's actually been going on throughout the 20th century. Talk a little bit about speed, like how speed is sort of a drug for propelling this futuring forward.
That's a great way of putting it, Spencer. I think basically the point here is that you have acceleration that continues apace, and obviously it doubles upon itself. The great example of this is Moore's law, which was invented by a computer scientist called Gordon Moore, who predicted that computational power would double every year, which turned out not to be quite right, but it's close enough to being right that it's quite amazing that he came up with it in like 1961, when computers, again, were the size of rooms. And of course, they get smaller and smaller as they get more and more powerful. We all know this. But what the effect of this is quite hard to calculate. So I mentioned already this term future shock that started to be bandied about in the 1970s. Heidi and Alvin Toffler invented this. And basically the idea here is that the future, moving through time at such an acceleration is sort of like going to a country where you don't speak the language or you don't know the customs. So they said, we know the idea of culture shock, but what we're all experiencing is the temporal version of that future shock, right? And the way that I write about it in the book is that eventually you get to this experience of feeling drowned in futurity, drowned in the future. So the last chapter is called The Flood. And this is the chapter about postmodernism or postmodernity. And you feel constantly swept away by the onrushing tide of events and feel uncertain and destabilized at all times, hence the political consequences that I described earlier. But that's really not something that I think the general population is beginning to feel until the late 20th century. You have people writing about it in a strangely prophetic way early on, like Mumford, but it's not really becoming a general concern or general experience, I would argue, until the late 20th century. And then again, only in some parts of the world, of which America is perhaps the apex example.
It's hard to read your book and not think about the fact that we are such a time illiterate society, that we actually don't think about time we think in time in a very like linear way, almost a progressive line. Of course, we know time doesn't work that way, but I guess, what do you make of that time illiteracy in the context of your book, and also how do you think about that in the context of today? Big question, I know.
That strikes me as the ultimate Spencer Bailey question. I feel like that's the question you're always effectively asking everyone. Yeah, I mean, that's right. Because if you think about it, if you think about time as an arrow or as a linear experience, then by definition it's in one ear, out the other, right? Which generally we don't think is a good idea. And the amnesiac consequences of thinking of things mainly in terms of progress are evident to see. I suppose the reason I wrote the book is to contest that temporal illiteracy as you're describing it. I hadn't thought of it that way, but the whole point is, and that pretzelness that we started the conversation with, that going back to the past, future, etc. It was really an attempt to understand the experience of time in this more, I don't know, to create a kind of discursive space in which that could be held and explored. One thing I will say about postmodernism, which I feel like I was sounding quite negative about it a moment ago, but of course that has another side too, because what postmodernism in design and architecture and art and other fields as well, literature, poetry, music, the attempt there was to get away from the progressive linear model and to try to create a more three-dimensional understanding of temporal possibility, formal possibility, where things could overlap, conjoin, sit alongside one another. This is why you have historicism in architecture, for example. It's why you have a kind of interest in collage and fragmentation, this sort of breaking down of things that you might associate in music with someone like Talking Heads or Grace Jones. That's a very conscious departure from that linear modernist progressive mode, and I feel extremely informed by that. I feel like in a lot of ways this is like a postmodern book, because I'm not so much interested in, well, I always like to say that modernism pretends to be a clear window on the world that gives you this view that you can trust, and postmodernism is like a smashed mirror that's just jagged fragments that reflects you back at yourself and all these pieces that you can't put together again. And I feel like now we're perhaps in a postmodern condition, if I can put it that way, where we're thinking more about a three-dimensional space that's not constrained to that planar experience at all, but one where we can all inhabit in different ways that's perspectival and collegial and collaborative in some way. And I guess the ethic of the book is to try to write about futurology from that point of view.
And you mentioned music. Film is another, plays a role here. Talk about filmmakers as futurologists, because you definitely touch on that in the book. And I think we'll probably finish on the subject of design, because we are at a design fair. We should probably talk about that. But speak to film real quick, because I think film plays a very important role in the public imagination in terms of how we inhabit the present, thinking about the future.
Right. And one reason for that, of course, is that film can show you a future in a very charismatic and convincing and compelling way that couldn't be done in 3 dimensions, at least not with 20th century technology. Maybe we're just getting there now. So it can create an unreality that you can actually be inside psychologically. So that was why it's the ultimate futurological art form, you could argue. So in the book, I talk particularly about Sergei Eisenstein, a Soviet filmmaker. There's one scene in a film that he made where he shows a milk processing machine coming to a peasant village, and the peasants are all very suspicious of it. They actually look a lot like characters in a Bosch painting, funnily enough. And then the one progressive peasant turns it on and the milk starts flowing, and it's this kind of utopian and also quite ejaculatory or mammary image of life suddenly bursting out of the machine. So it's this real kind of progressive idea. And of course, he's doing a lot of incredible things with editing and cinematography that are rightly understood as very innovative and modernist. So that's the kind of great example of the modernist film. And then at the end of the storyline, you have something like Koyaanisqatsi. Do people remember the film Koyaanisqatsi, the one with the Philip Glass soundtrack, which is this kind of perpetual motion machine of sound, and you have all this stop motion sped up footage of the city, and it's like Future Shock for an hour and a half, and it's about the destruction of the natural environment through speed. So it's exactly what you were talking about earlier. So the way that film is used both, well, always imaginatively, but sometimes in a kind of utopian celebratory mode for a certain kind of futurology, and then in a kind of critical dystopian mode is very, very interesting.
So in the time we have left, what are some of the design objects or machines in the book that you feel like we should share with the audience, just in terms of expressing this futuring through object?
Yeah, so we haven't talked about Buckminster Fuller yet, who I think is for people in our field, he's probably the first person that comes to mind when you think of a futurologist, probably. And it's interesting, we have the Fly Eye Dome here in the Miami Design District. Craig Robbins acquired it, and it's sitting there now as a fixture of the civic environment. And he's just, well, a singular but great example of someone who thought of the future in structural terms. So basically is again super complicated, but basically he thought that designers had to manage to think like nature thinks, right? So he wanted to see designers developing forms organically, which to him meant super efficiently, and he wouldn't have drawn a very strong contrast between the machine and the organic. So I think of him as a kind of garden thinker, like two of the chapters are called Machine and Garden. The idea there being that you can build a futurological structure that's like a machine that's very, again, constrained and has outputs and very powerful, but is very limited in what it can do. Or you can think of the future like a garden that you're trying to propagate, and he's that, right? Despite being very technophilic, being very interested in new technology. And right at the same time, you have all these other designers like Norman Belgettis, who did the Futurama for the World's Fair, who are working with the streamlining imagery that I mentioned earlier. The idea there being that the streamlined car or bicycle or train or airplane or toaster or pencil sharpener sort of looks like it's leaning forward into the future, like it's going to arrive before everything else in the room, you know? And so that's a kind of, again, utopian progressive model of the future that's been materialized. And then if you go all the way to the end of the story or even to the present, if you walk around and Design Miami, what you see are a lot of objects that effectively have absorbed the logic of the prototype into themselves and have that quality of experimentation and almost wear it as a kind of badge of honor or a badge of courage, and are I guess presenting themselves to you not in utopian terms or even really in problem-solving terms, which is again a very modernist way of thinking about design, but instead more experiential, emotional, personal terms. And I feel like, without maybe exaggerating too much, you can think of Design Miami as a kind of cabinet of curiosities of private futures, right? It's like a future generating machine. That's what the platform is all about, even more than the art fair across the street, because design is where the rubber hits the road, right? It has to be materialized intelligently. It needs to deal with manufacturing. It needs to deal with function and the body and so on. So it really enters your space psychically and physically in a different way. And I think that the sophistication that design has achieved in the last 100 years as compared to the kind of cartoon version of streamlining and the kind of wonderful diversification and participation that you have in Design Miami now, it shows that you actually can get better at dealing with the future if you pay attention.
I'm so glad you went there. I have one final question I just want to get out, which is to take us outside of the fair. Who would you say are some of the great designer, architect, futurologists of our time? Who are some of the people you're paying attention to that you think a book like yours right now and 100 years from now would be writing about?
Yeah, so I'll just mention three people that I've just worked with a lot. So one would be Joris Laarman. So not a very surprising choice, but he, very well-known Dutch designer working with algorithms. So he would be a very good instance of a designer that thinks of technology as a tool of empowerment, but doesn't necessarily think of it as, he doesn't want to give the technology too much say, right? So he thinks of it as a form generation. Technology is a form generation mechanism, but he's still kind of a poet of form, and it's very personal still, which I think he doesn't maybe get enough credit for. I would also love to mention Stephen Burks, and specifically a project you might not know because it's brand new, but he's just done a project called Ancestors, where he really was interested to work with artificial intelligence, but he's also very concerned with the past, and in particular the past of the Black diaspora and how it informs the possibility of working now. So what he did was to bring all of these images of African sculpture, but also particular Black thinkers and historical figures like Malcolm X and Bell Hooks, and kind of fuse them into these digital objects that he then translated into furniture. It's so ingenious to me because it's like using technology to create a kind of Afrofuturist cerebral space that can result in a form. Super, super interesting. So you're going to see that work coming forward soon. It's called Ancestors by Stephen Burks. And then the last person I'll mention actually is Hella Jongerius. So I'm working on a project with her at the Vitra Design Museum and curating her retrospective. And she kind of brings the conversation full circle because she's so craft intensive And she made a big wave in the design field recently by writing a manifesto with Louisa Schuvenberg, the design critic, that was basically a manifesto against the new, right? So she was saying designers have to stop thinking of newness as being a value in its own right, as novelty as a positive thing. Not so much that they weren't writing against the new as like, don't make anything new at all. They were saying new is value neutral. So innovation or originality even is not something that we should care about, which I think is so true. And it's very interesting to see her charting her own career over almost half a century now with that attitude in mind and the recursive structures that occur in her textile design and furniture and commissioned work for Vitra and KLM, all these other companies she's worked with, and a sort of non-innovation based set of values. And lo and behold, the most recent project she's done for Salon 94 is just clay sculptures of really pissed off animal heads, right? Like monkeys and sharks and rhinos just sort of growling at you, like nature sort of protesting the imposition of the new on itself. And so it sort of brings things back to craft as still being super important to me and super relatable to me. But also there you have a designer who it seems to me is thinking about time in that same recursive, complex way that we were just describing that I've tried to achieve in the book.
Glenn, thank you. That's all the time we have. Get A Century of Tomorrows. He'll be signing the book, so stick around. And congratulations.
Thanks, Spencer.